The morning my daughter changed the locks on my own house, I was standing on the front porch in my good coat, holding a casserole dish still warm from the oven, because that is the kind of woman I am. The kind who brings food. The kind who shows up. The kind who, apparently, needed to be taught a lesson about whose name was actually on the deed. Natalie opened the door just wide enough that I could see the new brass deadbolt behind her. She smiled the way she always smiled at me. Patient. Practiced. Like I was a child who needed things explained slowly. "Mom," she said. And that one word had a whole speech inside it. "We talked about this." We hadn't talked about anything. That was the thing. We never actually talked. What we did was Natalie talked, and my son nodded, and I sat there trying to find the version of myself that was agreeable enough to keep the peace. I had spent 61 years being agreeable. I was very good at it. It turned out agreeable was exactly what they were counting on. I handed her the casserole. I said, "Of course, sweetheart." I walked back to my car, and I sat in the driveway for a long moment before I started the engine. Then I drove straight to my attorney's office. What they didn't know, what Natalie had never once thought to ask about, was that 6 weeks earlier I had already made a phone call that changed everything. They just didn't know it yet. My name is Beverly, and I want to tell you the whole story, not to make myself look good, because I made mistakes in this. Real ones. But because I think there are women out there sitting in cars in their own driveways right now, and they need to know that quiet is not the same as finished. My husband Clifford passed away 2 years ago, April. 38 years together. He was an engineer, methodical in everything, including the way he loved me. He didn't say it often, but he showed it constantly in the way he checked my tire pressure every Sunday morning and remembered every small thing I mentioned, wanting, and never once made me feel like a burden for having needs. He built what we had carefully. A house in a good neighborhood in Columbus paid off. A rental property across town, steady income for 12 years, savings accounts, a portfolio he managed himself with books from the library, and a yellow legal pad he kept in the top desk drawer. When he died, I sat across from our estate attorney, a man named Mr. Hartley who had the kind of face that never gave anything away, and I listened to him explain what Clifford had left behind. It was more than I had known. Significantly more. I didn't tell anyone. Not my daughter Claire. Not my son-in-law Damon. Not my book club friends or my sister in Phoenix. I went home, I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at the kitchen table where Clifford and I had eaten 38 years of breakfasts, and I cried for about an hour. Then I stopped because Clifford would have told me to stop, and I started thinking. Natalie came into our lives when my one son Eli, was 29. He brought her to Thanksgiving. She was lovely. I mean that without sarcasm. She was genuinely lovely in the way that some people are lovely when they want something and they are skilled at wanting it. She asked me questions about myself that night. Good questions, and she listened to the answers with her whole face. She helped clear the table without being asked. She touched Eli's arm lightly when he told a story and laughed in exactly the right places. I liked her. I want to be honest about that. I liked her for almost a year. The first thing I noticed was so small that I almost didn't notice it at all. We were at Sunday dinner, about 8 months after Clifford passed. Eli and Natalie had been engaged for 2 months at that point. She was telling me about the condo they were renting and how much they loved the neighborhood. And she said, very casually, in the middle of a perfectly ordinary sentence, "Of course, once things settle, you probably won't need all this space." She gestured at my kitchen, where I had taught Eli to make scrambled eggs and hung his artwork on the refrigerator and sat with him through 3 nights of the flu when he was 12 years old, and burning up and asking for his father. I didn't react. I said, maybe so, and passed the bread rolls. But I heard it, and I started listening differently after that. It came in waves. That's the thing about this kind of thing. It never hits you all at once, because if it did you'd recognize it for what it was. It came in suggestions, small ones wrapped in concern. Natalie mentioned to Eli that I seemed lonely in that big house. Natalie mentioned that she'd read an article about how older women who downsize reported higher life satisfaction. Natalie mentioned, offhandedly, that the real estate market was strong right now, if I ever thought about it. And Eli began to carry these suggestions to me as if they were his own ideas. At first I thought I was imagining it. The way Eli's opinions had started to sound like someone else's phrasing. "Mom, don't you think you'd be happier somewhere more manageable?" He'd never used the word manageable in his life. That was Natalie's word. She used it about everything she wanted to move out of the way. Then there was the weekend they came to help me organize the garage, which turned into Natalie moving through my house, making notes on her phone, while Eli held boxes and said nothing. I saw her photograph the built-in bookshelves in the living room. I saw her stand in the doorway of Clifford's study for a long time with a look on her face that I recognized from when Eli had been little and wanted a toy at the store. That waiting look, that calculating look. I offered them coffee. I kept my face pleasant. I started making notes of my own when they left. 6 months after Clifford died, Eli sat down with me at this same kitchen table and told me he'd been thinking. He thought it might make sense for me to put the house in a joint trust. Him, Natalie, and me. So that the family could make decisions together if anything ever happened to me. He had paperwork, an actual printed document that he set on the table between us. I looked at my son who had Clifford's eyes and my mother's stubbornness, and who had cried at his own dog's funeral when he was 9 years old. And I asked him quietly, who had drawn up that paperwork. He said an attorney, a friend of Natalie's. I said I needed time to think about it. I poured him more coffee. I walked them to the door, and I hugged Eli for a little longer than usual. Then I called Mr. Hartley. What I learned in that call is that the document Eli had presented me was legal, technically. It was also specifically structured so that my ability to make decisions independently would be significantly constrained within 18 months of signing. Mr. Hartley explained this to me in his careful, even voice, and then he said something I wrote down on a sticky note and kept on the edge of my bathroom mirror for the next 4 months. He said, "Beverly, the best thing you can do right now is nothing visible." I had always been good at nothing visible. I'd been doing it my entire life. Here is what I did over the following 4 months, quietly, without telling anyone. First, I met with Mr. Hartley 3 more times. We reviewed Clifford's estate in full. We discussed options. We structured a revocable living trust that put everything, the house, the rental property, the investments, under my sole control with very specific terms about what would happen if I became incapacitated and what would happen when I passed. The terms were mine, nobody else's. Second, I hired a woman named Ms. Greer, a private research consultant Mr. Hartley recommended. She was a small, efficient woman who wore sensible shoes and spoke in complete sentences, and found things out without anyone knowing she was looking. What she found was this. Natalie had been in a long-term relationship before Eli, a man in his 50s, a widower, comfortable. That relationship had ended after 13 months with a quiet legal settlement involving property. There were no criminal charges. There was a restraining order that had been dropped. The man had moved to Florida. He did not return calls. There was more. Natalie had co-signed on a business loan 2 years before she met Eli. The business had folded. The debt had been restructured twice. She was not underwater, but she was not standing on solid ground either. She was standing on Eli's ground, and through Eli, she was trying to stand on mine. Third, I began keeping records. Not dramatically. Not with a hidden camera, or anything that felt like a television movie. Just a small spiral notebook where I wrote down dates and conversations and the specific words people used. When Eli said, "Natalie thinks you're not being realistic about the future," I wrote that down. When Natalie asked me, very warmly, whether I had considered what would happen to the rental property if I had a health event, I wrote that down. When she asked, a different Sunday, whether I had updated my will recently and whether Eli was the executor, I wrote that down. By month 4 I had 11 pages of notes. Mr. Hartley said they painted a clear picture. I did not confront anyone. I did not warn Eli. I did not call Natalie and tell her what I knew. Because the thing about people like Natalie is that confrontation is their territory. They are very good at it. They know how to reframe. How to cry at exactly the right moment. How to make you look like the aggressor when you are the one who has been backed into a corner. I had watched Natalie do this with Eli during 2 small disagreements I'd witnessed, and I had taken careful note of how it worked. My silence was not weakness. My silence was strategy. And then came October. A cool gray Tuesday morning when Eli called and told me that he and Natalie had talked and they felt it would be best if I tried living in the in-law suite of their new rental for a few months to see if I liked it. The house, my house, could be listed in the spring. They would handle the listing. They had already spoken to a realtor, They had already spoken to a realtor about my house. Without asking me, I took a breath. I said, "Let me think about that, sweetheart." I kept my voice warm, easy, unbothered. That same afternoon, I drove over to see the house. I still had my key. It worked. That was when I found the locks had been changed. 3 days later, I came by to pick up a planter from the back porch that had been my mother's, and my key didn't turn. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the knob, and then I knocked and Natalie opened the door. "My door," she said very gently. "Oh, we had to rekey everything. The locksmith said the cylinders were old. I'll get you a copy made, I just haven't had time." She never made me a copy. I drove away from my own front porch and I sat in my car in the parking lot of a Kroger 2 blocks away. And I will tell you honestly that I sat there for about 20 minutes doing nothing but breathing. I wasn't crying. I was past crying. I was thinking about Clifford. About the way he used to say, when he was working through a complicated problem, "Beverly, the answer is always simpler than you think. You just have to be patient enough to wait for it to become obvious." The answer had become obvious. I called Mr. Hartley from that parking lot. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Good, then we move." The following Thursday, Eli received a certified letter from Mr. Hartley's office. It was a formal notification that the property at our family address was owned outright by a revocable living trust, established 3 months prior, of which I was the sole trustee. It outlined clearly and specifically that no transfer of the property could occur without my written consent, and that any actions taken to represent the property to third parties, including real estate professionals, without my authorization as trustee constituted a civil matter that Mr. Hartley was prepared to address. At the bottom, there was a note about the private research findings regarding Natalie's prior legal history and financial situation, summarized professionally, with documentation attached. Eli called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He called again 20 minutes later. I let that go too. I was sitting in my living room with a glass of iced tea, looking at the bookshelves that Natalie had photographed on her phone, and I felt something I hadn't felt in almost 2 years. I felt like myself. Not the agreeable version, not the version that brought casseroles and kept her voice pleasant and chose peace over truth every single time. The actual version. The one Clifford had loved. The one who knew the difference between peace and surrender. Eli came to my house the next morning. He knocked. I opened the door and let him in. He looked like he'd had a bad night. There were shadows under his eyes that Clifford used to get when he was troubled, and seeing them on Eli's face made my chest hurt in a way that had nothing to do with anger. He sat at the kitchen table and he didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at his hands. Then he said, "Mom, the letter said she had a history. It said there was a settlement, a restraining order." I said, "Yes." He said, "Is it true?" I said, "Mr. Hartley does not put things in letters that are not documented." He was quiet again. Then he said, "She told me it was a misunderstanding, that the man was unstable, that he'd made things up." I looked at my son. I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to ask him why he had brought paperwork to my kitchen table drawn up by a lawyer he'd never met. I wanted to ask him why he'd let a realtor be called about my house without ever asking me. I wanted to ask him when he had last made a decision that was entirely his own. But I had learned, somewhere in those 4 months of keeping notes and saying nothing visible, that the most important things are sometimes better shown than said. So instead I got up, went to the bedroom, and came back with a manila folder. I set it on the table in front of him. It held 11 pages of my spiral notebook, photographed and printed. It held Ms. Greer's summary report. It held the paperwork Eli had brought me that first time, with annotations from Mr. Hartley noting exactly what each clause meant in plain language. Eli went through it slowly. He didn't speak while he read. When he finished, he closed the folder and he put both hands flat on the table, the way Clifford used to do when he was steadying himself. He looked at me, and his eyes were wet. And not in the way of someone embarrassed, but in the way of someone who has just understood something that they cannot undo. He said, "When did you figure it out?" I said, "The Sunday she photographed your grandfather's bookshelves on her phone while you were holding the recycling boxes." He closed his eyes. I poured us both coffee. I put a plate of the cookies I'd made the day before on the table between us, because that is still the kind of woman I am. The kind who brings food. The kind who shows up. It just took me a while to understand that showing up doesn't always mean walking through the door they've opened for you. Sometimes it means having already thought about what comes next before they've finished turning the lock. What happened after was not simple and it was not fast. Those things never are. Natalie retained an attorney within 2 weeks of Eli receiving the letter. She made claims against what she called promised assets, citing conversations she and Eli had apparently had about the future of the property. Her attorney sent a letter to Mr. Hartley. Mr. Hartley sent a letter back. The letters were, I gathered, quite thorough on both sides. It did not proceed to litigation. Ms. Greer's documentation, combined with the prior legal history from Natalie's previous relationship, made that particular path very unappealing. They negotiated a quiet resolution. Natalie signed something. She and Eli separated 2 months later, a fact Eli told me on a phone call on a Wednesday afternoon, in a voice that was raw and tired but also, underneath, a little relieved. Like someone who has been holding their breath for a long time, and finally remembered it was allowed to stop. The divorce was finalized 9 months after that. I will not tell you it was easy to watch my son go through it. It wasn't. He lost weight in the first month. He called me at odd hours sometimes, not to talk about anything specific, just to talk. I drove to his apartment with food 3 times a week for a while, not because he asked but because he is my son and I know him, and I know that when he is struggling he forgets to eat actual meals. He is 34 years old, and he still forgets to eat actual meals when he is struggling. We didn't talk about Natalie much directly. What we talked about instead was his father. Clifford had known Eli in a way that only fathers who really pay attention ever know their sons, and Eli had never had enough time to fully understand that. We started to fill in some of those gaps together. Eli would ask me something. What Clifford had thought about a particular thing. What he'd been like at Eli's age. Whether he'd ever doubted himself badly enough that it scared him. And I would answer as honestly as I could. Which sometimes meant saying I don't know, and sometimes meant telling him things I'd never told anyone, because there'd never seemed to be a reason before. About a year after everything, Eli came to the house for dinner on a regular Tuesday. Not a holiday, not a milestone, just a Tuesday. He let himself in with the key I had given him. My spare key, the one that has always been his. He sat at the table while I finished cooking, and at some point he asked me, without looking up from his phone, "Mom, did you ever think about confronting her? Just saying everything directly?" I put down the spoon I was holding and I thought about it honestly. "Yes," I said, "every day for 4 months. Why didn't you?" I turned back to the stove. Because confrontation was her language. I was never going to beat her at it. I had to wait until I could speak mine. He was quiet then. "What's your language?" I thought about Clifford. About the yellow legal pad in the desk drawer. About 38 years of a man who built things slowly and said less than he meant, and trusted the process completely. "Documentation," I said. "And patience." Ellie nodded. He didn't say anything else, but after dinner he stayed and washed the dishes without being asked. The way he used to do when he was a teenager trying to make up for something without words. And it was so familiar that it made me smile into the pot I was drying. I am not going to stand here and tell you I got everything right. I didn't. There were moments I should have said something directly to Eli. Early, clearly. Before things had moved as far as they had. There was a version of this where I sat him down the night. I first saw Natalie photograph those bookshelves and said, "Son, I need you to hear me say something uncomfortable." I was afraid of losing him. I mistook keeping access for keeping the relationship. And those are not the same thing. But here is what I know now. There is a certain kind of person who looks at a woman my age, living alone in a house that is paid off, and sees opportunity. They don't see the 38 years of lunches packed, and overtime shifts worked and Sundays given over and arguments swallowed because the family needed someone to swallow them. They see square footage. They see an asset without an advocate. They see someone they can move. What they miss every time is what's already been put in place. The phone calls made from parking lots. The attorneys who have been on retainer for decades. The husbands who knew, even from the far side of a terrible illness, that the world would try this, and who made sure the woman they loved had what she needed before it did. Clifford wrote me a letter too, the week before he passed. He gave it to Mr. Hartley to pass on after the estate meeting. I read it once and then put it away. Because some things are too true to look at every day. The part I keep thinking about said this: Beverly, you are the most underestimated person I have ever known. I want you to let them underestimate you. It's always been your best advantage. I let them underestimate me. They saw a woman in a good coat with a warm casserole dish, who was easy to move aside. They saw agreeable. They saw the version of me that had learned, over 6 decades, to soften her edges for other people's comfort. They didn't see the version that had been paying attention all along. And the question I want to leave you with today, the one I genuinely sit with, is this. Who in your life right now is looking at your stillness and seeing weakness? Who is counting on you to stay agreeable just a little longer while they finish what they've started? And what have they not thought to ask about? Because I promise you, in most cases, there is something. There is always something they haven't thought to ask about. Think about it. And if this story felt familiar, if any part of it sounded like a Tuesday morning you've lived, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. This is Selina Payback. I'll see you in the next one.